First, you learn to count not in liters and kilograms. You count in the hours that separate you from the next sleep, from the next sip of water, from the next minute when the enemy Spitfires are not hanging over your head like persistent, all-knowing flies. Here, in Tunisia, on this scorched, devastated earth, war ceased to be a maneuver or a battle of wills. It became pure, cold arithmetic. And the numbers I crunched every night in my makeshift headquarters clearly told me we weren't just losing. We should have been dead 3 months ago. I am Hauptmann Johann Muller, 32 years old, former Polytechnic student, now a supply and transport officer attached to what remained of the 21st Panzer Division. I stared at my calculations, using my last worn-down pencil and a sheet of paper salvaged from an archive, its reverse side still bearing the faint imprint of some irrelevant pre-war bureaucratic nonsense. The formula was brutally simple. Need, fuel, ammunition, water, minus supply, what little miraculously broke through Malta and Bizerta, multiplied by attrition, machinery ruined by sand and heat. The result was always negative, deeply negative. I knew that in Berlin, in those cool, marble corridors, they portrayed us as heroes, the desert foxes accomplishing the impossible. They spoke of Geist, spirit. But spirit, I had long since discovered, was no substitute for octane ratings. Outside, 5 feet from my desk, was the sand. It wasn't merely grains. It was fine, corrosive, omnipresent sandpaper that infiltrated carburetors, scoured tires, clogged pores, and ruined everything it touched. In the silence of the night, when the artillery was quiet, the only sound was the grating of that sand. It was as if Africa itself was scratching its claws across the edge of our endurance. I was an engineer. I loved order, precision. Before the war, I could plan the movement of 1,000 tons of cargo over the Alps, hitting the schedule to the minute. Here, I was planning how to stretch our water reserves for 2 days so 500 men wouldn't succumb to dehydration, all while awaiting an order that would likely never arrive. Our generals, even Rommel, when he was here, were afforded the luxury of genius, of strategic risk. My risk was different. My risk was deciding who received the last jerrycan of petrol, the wounded, or the crew of the 88mm flak gun that might, just might, shoot down an enemy reconnaissance plane and buy us another silent hour. Victory, as depicted on the posters, smelled of glory and parades. My war smelled of diesel, stale sweat, and desperation. Above all, it smelled of a profound bitterness, the realization that all my expertise, my discipline, my German tenacity, was insignificant against the simple, dull, unideological, yet completely overwhelming volume of industrial output somewhere across the ocean. They say war is chaos. I learned to manage chaos. True war begins when you realize the enemy isn't seeking victory in a fair fight. He is simply burying you under such a tonnage of steel that you become a mathematical error, scheduled for deletion. And I, Hauptmann Muller, was the man calculating the exact moment of our erasure. I ran a finger across the ledger. If the reported convoy failed to arrive tomorrow morning, 3 panzer platoons holding the southern flank would become immobile iron coffins within 48 hours. And I could do nothing about it, but record the number. The midday heat was not merely high temperature. It was physical assault. The air shimmered, distorting the outlines of derelict equipment and distant hills. You constantly felt your brain slowly cooking inside your skull, and any water you drank seemed to evaporate instantly, never quite reaching your kidneys. I stepped out of the bunker for an inspection. Our small transport pool was sheltered in a rocky wadi, providing minimal protection from air attacks. It was a veritable collection of metal invalids. Opel Blitz trucks, rusty Mercedes that looked like they remembered the Great War, and a few captured British vehicles that ran on slightly better fuel. If we had fuel, that is. Captain, a hoarse voice greeted me. It was Feldwebelmeyer. Around 50, from Bavaria, he had run an automotive repair shop before the war. He was gold in this sandy hell. He could coax an engine back to life with little more than chewing gum and a prayer. But his face was currently smeared with grease and resentment. What is it, Meyer? What is it? We have a pile of hot, old junk, Captain. 12 blitzes are grounded. 6 have fuel pump issues. New diaphragms. I last saw those in Tripoli a year ago. The others need new bearings. The sand. Sand. Sand, and more sand. We greased them, Captain. We clean them. But this monster eats every moving part. Meyer spat into the sand. It was perhaps the only excess liquid we could afford to waste. And the tigers? Tiger number 322. Standing. Orders came to move it to Bizerta if it's operational. Is it? It is operational. Only, we don't have the fuel to get it there. We siphoned everything we could from our last reserve. Enough to drive, maybe until lunch. And then, stand there waiting for some hurricane to land and strip it for souvenirs. I nodded. The heavy, sluggish tiger was a symbol of our technical prowess, but here in Africa, it was also a symbol of our idiocy. Build a tank that consumes fuel like a small city, then send it to a desert where every can of fuel requires 3 more cans to deliver that first can. A logistical nightmare. Headquarters reported a major convoy. I said, attempting to sound optimistic. Tomorrow, the day after at the latest. Fuel. 88mm shells. New tires. Meyer looked at me the way one looks at a man who promised gold and delivered a handful of gravel. A convoy. God willing, Captain. But you've been talking about a convoy for 3 weeks. Meanwhile, I have to decide whose spark plugs to use. The ones for the trucks or the ones for the generator powering the radio. We operated under conditions of grinding, escalating deceit. Propaganda spoke of tenacity and inevitable victory. Reality spoke of the iron law of Africa. If you can't get the resources, you die of thirst, starvation, or enemy fire. Here, death by enemy fire was often considered the most merciful. I returned to the bunker to check communications. The radio, powered by Meyer's perpetually strained generator, crackled and hissed. Headquarters, Hauptmann Muller, 21st. This is Lieutenant Colonel Kerner speaking. Kerner. His voice was dry, official, sounding as if he were in Berlin, not a few hundred kilometers from the collapsing front line. Report, Captain. We await information on transport readiness. The General requires immediate preparation for reinforcing the South. We must repel their breakthrough. We must demonstrate that Rommel's genius. Lieutenant Colonel. I cut him off, striving to keep my voice level. I have seen the reports. Of the 3 companies you plan to send to the front, not one can be fully fueled for a journey of more than 100 kilometers. And that's without accounting for combat. I am not talking about losses in battle. I am talking about losses on the march due to a simple dry tank. A silence hung on the other end. That is unacceptable, Captain. Berlin demands action. Resources will arrive. The convoy is en route. You must have faith. I only have faith in physics, Lieutenant Colonel, I said, past caring about subordination. A diesel engine has no ideology. It requires fuel. I replaced the receiver. My duty as an officer was to make the machines move. But how do you compel something to move when, by all laws of mechanics and logistics, it should remain still? I glanced at my figures. Wait. All that remained was waiting for that ghostly convoy, the single hope separating us from utter ruin. The convoy. The word was uttered with such reverence, as if it were not a line of trucks, but the Holy Grail itself. I didn't sleep all night, checking the list of critical items. 20,000 liters of diesel, 15,000 liters of high-octane petrol for the planes, hundreds of crates of shells, and most importantly, spare parts. Not just any parts, but the specific, scarce components for the gearboxes that failed under the overload and the omnipresent sand. At dawn, through the heat haze, we saw the dust. A small cloud, but it grew, approaching from the direction of Bizerta. A joyous shout went up. Ours. I took my old Opel, one of the few still running, and drove to meet them. With me was Lieutenant Kramer, a young, fanatical man who still believed the propaganda and wore a clean uniform despite the conditions. He stared at the dust cloud with almost religious awe. You see, Captain, Kramer said excitedly, the Führer won't abandon us. They sent us the best. We will break the backs of these Americans and British. God grant it, Lieutenant. I muttered, thinking that breaking backs required at least 5 full trainloads of ammunition, not one convoy which, judging by the dust, consisted of barely a dozen vehicles. As we got closer, hope began to dissipate. The convoy comprised 8 trucks, 2 light armored cars for escort, and a single tractor which, I noted, was towing a tanker. The tanker was there. We stopped. The convoy commander, Hauptmann Schneider, climbed out of his cab, wiping sweat. He looked exhausted and filthy, but wore a smile. The smile of a man who had completed an impossible mission. Hauptmann Muller, he saluted. Delivered. 48 hours of hell, but we broke through. I walked past him toward the tanker. This was my immediate concern. Fuel. I tapped the metal. A dull sound. Full. Diesel? I asked, struggling to suppress a rush of relief. No, Captain, Schneider said, a touch of pride in his voice. It's drinking water. Excellent quality. For the field hospital and the airfields. Refreshing, Captain. I felt the tension that had held me together for 3 days suddenly snap like an over-tightened string. I stared at him. Water? Schneider, we have some water. We have no petrol. We have no diesel. Half our equipment is immobilized. But Berlin ordered water delivered as a priority. Hygiene and combat readiness. I turned away to avoid screaming. This wasn't merely a mistake. This was systemic madness. They sent us water when our machines were grounded, because without the machines, we would die anyway, clean water or not. I began inspecting the trucks. The first truck, crates of rations. Canned goods I hadn't seen since 1938. Useful, but not critical. The second truck, field post. Sacks of letters and crates of uniforms. New, fine, heavy winter uniforms for the Eastern Front. Thick wool. In Tunisia, where temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius, they had sent us uniforms in which we would literally boil alive. The third truck was the one that finished me. It was packed to the brim. The labels read, critically important spare parts. I ordered the soldiers to open a crate. Inside, meticulously packed in straw, lay shiny, new, perfectly machined bearings and chassis components designed for early model Panthers. Panthers that had never reached Africa, or, if they had, were long since abandoned at the docks. I took one bearing in my hand. Heavy, cold, coated in factory grease. A perfect piece of German engineering. Absolutely useless. My vital transport stood idle for want of cheap, standard Opel bearings, and I was sent luxury items for tanks we didn't possess. I looked at Schneider. He stood there, chest puffed out. He saw no absurdity. He saw a mission accomplished. Schneider, my voice was dry as Tunisian dust. You brought us uniforms for the Russian winter, parts for tanks we don't have, and water that we should have sourced locally. Where, in God's name, is the fuel? Where are the shells for the 88s? It was all in the other convoy. Captain, Schneider lowered his voice. But it was intercepted near Sicily. Sunk. We were the only ones who got through. We salvaged what we could. I closed my eyes. Sunk. All our hope, all our strategy, drowned somewhere in the Mediterranean. German professionalism, German will, German discipline, all washed away by the waves. I felt my face turn to stone. Lieutenant Kramer, standing next to me, looked like he had been struck. Ideology had collided with reality, and reality had won by a humiliating margin. Thank you, Schneider, I said. You can unload your water, and give your men some rest. Then I will order you to load up all this shit, and take it back to the port. If we can't fuel the trucks, at least the enemy won't get them. At that moment, I realized, this was not just defeat. It was farce. After the arrival of the dry cargo, the real starvation began. Everything was scarce, but fuel was critically so. Every can of petrol or diesel became a sacred object, and its expenditure, a matter of supreme strategic planning. I had to sign permissions daily for fuel distribution. Hauptmann Muller's signature on that scrap of paper was worth more than gold. I had become a sort of logistical judge. Captain, an agitated lieutenant from an artillery unit burst in. We need 200 liters. We must move the Pak 40 gun to Hill 311. The Americans are massing there. How many shells do you have? I asked. A full complement. But we need fire on target. You will receive 50 liters. That is enough to reach the position and fire exactly 20 rounds. After that, your gun will be immobile. Use every shot as if it were the last. If you miss, I will cut your next water ration. My job devolved into a zero-sum game. To give to one, I had to take from another. The bitterest struggle was over water and fuel for the ambulances. The medical units traditionally held priority, but even this sanctuary was threatened. Hans, Dr. Kruger, our chief surgeon, appealed to me. I need water for flushing wounds, and fuel to evacuate the serious cases. They are dying of gangrene and heat stroke on the road. Doctor, I rubbed my weary eyes. I allocated you 100 liters, but it's the last reserve. I took it from the generator powering the headquarters radio. We will be operating in silence today, but without communication. Do you understand we won't know when the general retreat is ordered? I understand, I replied coldly. But I prefer our men die from a shell than from blood poisoning in our own trucks. We choose the lesser evil. The dilemma was perpetual. Save a life now, or secure communications to, potentially, save lives later? I chose now, because tomorrow might not come. One day, when the fuel was completely depleted, an order arrived from Army headquarters for requisition from local farmers in a small oasis village. It was a disgrace. We, the invincible German army, were reduced to stealing from civilians. I sent Meyer with a couple of soldiers. They returned 5 hours later, angry and empty-handed. What did you find? I asked. Meyer slammed 2 small jerrycans onto the desk. Olive oil, Captain. Lots of it. And a little bit of petrol. Mostly for their old pump generator. Why so little? Because they are not idiots. They know we are losing. When we arrived, they looked at us without fear. Just contempt. They didn't resist. They just said, "We have none left. The English will come tomorrow, give it to them." We took this, Meyer pointed at the cans, but it barely covers the return trip. They laughed at us, Captain. Laughed in our faces. It was humiliating. Our great Africa Corps, which was supposed to conquer Egypt and the Suez, was forced to beg for fuel from Tunisian farmers who were already anticipating the enemy's arrival. I ordered the petrol mixed with the remaining reserve diesel. The engines would be damaged, but they could travel a few dozen more kilometers. We were no longer an army, but a band of desperate looters, fighting for our lives against the consuming greed of the desert and our own folly. On the 26th of February 1943, sitting in my bunker, I performed an analysis that fundamentally changed my perception of the war and my country. On the wall hung a massive, meticulously drawn map of Tunisia. Our current positions were marked in red pencil. The lines were short and intermittent, like the pulse of a dying man. The blue lines, based on intelligence data, showed the positions of the British, Americans, and even the Free French. The blue lines were long, confident, methodical, but the map was not my main concern. My primary worry was the table I had compiled. It was the supply balance, Tunisian front. I sat and compared. German resources, Jan, February 1943. Fuel, average daily delivery, that broke through 5,000 liters. Consumption, nominal 15,000 liters. Deficit, 10,000 liters per day. Equipment losses, destroyed/abandoned 250 units. Equipment delivery, arrived 12 units, older models. Allied resources, estimated from intelligence. Fuel, average daily delivery, 500,000 liters. Considering they controlled the ports of Algiers and Oran. Consumption, nominal irrelevant. They could afford to lose. Equipment losses, replaced within 72 hours. I stared at the numbers. 1 to 100. The disparity was not in tactics. It was in steel, in oil, in transport ships. We were losing this war at the level of fundamental material loss. I recalled the pride with which we spoke of our engineering genius. Our Tiger tank was the best in the world. The 88mm flak gun was legendary. But what good is the best gun if you have no shells to fire and no petrol to move it? The central revelation hit me with the weight of the entire European war. We did not lose the war because the Allies fought better. We lost because they could afford to lose battles, but win production. I pictured the factories of Detroit. Straight, gray, endless assembly lines churning out Chevrolet and Ford trucks. Simple, reliable machines that didn't require scarce parts and could run on any miserable fuel. I remembered how, in propaganda films, we laughed at low-quality American equipment. But there was so much of this low-quality equipment that it could simply bury us. And us? We built works of art that could be used for a few hours before standing idle, monuments to German pride, waiting to be salvaged by the sand or destroyed by enemy aircraft. I began to see the war differently. We weren't fighting against soldiers. We were fighting against oil derricks, steel mills, transport fleets. Against an enemy who had not only the resources but absolute, undisputed security in their rear. Here in Tunisia, we were under siege. And I, an expert in logistics, was tasked with provisioning a fortress that had no walls. I purged my mind of all notions of glory and duty. Only the mathematics remained. My sole task was to postpone the final zero for as long as possible. I decided to act against orders from Berlin, which demanded stockpiling for a decisive counteroffensive. If we waited, all reserves would be destroyed by our own hands. That evening, I summoned Meyer and a few of my most trusted men. I didn't lie. We probably have a week, I said. 10 days at most. The Allies are tightening the pincers from 3 sides. I will no longer wait for the ghost convoy. I unfolded the map. We are concentrating all remaining transport. We cease supplying distant positions that can only be held by infantry. One of the lieutenants started to protest. Captain, but we cannot abandon. We are not abandoning. We are making a choice. We use the remaining 4,000 liters of diesel to create a transport corridor that will operate only at night, when the Air Force is asleep. We will evacuate the wounded and everything that might be used later. Which is to say, nothing. Only men. This was insubordination. Orders demanded no retreat. Orders demanded holding the line. But I refused to spend the last drops of fuel maintaining the illusion of combat effectiveness where none existed. I sat and listened to Meyer's report. His voice sounded like dry bones scraping against stone. The transmissions on the Mercedes are a complete disaster. We can assemble 3 trucks, but they won't last more than 2 trips. We desperately need bearings. Cease the search, I ordered. Now we don't look for spare parts. We look for a tank or armored car that can be cannibalized to save a truck. Equipment cannibalism. I went outside to supervise the loading. Ambulances drove off in the dust, filled with groans. Nearby, a machine gun company stood ready for defense, awaiting their ammunition resupply that would never come. I looked into their eyes and felt like Judas. Suddenly, an engine roared. Dust and gravel flew into the air. An SS Hauptsturmfuhrer named Brandt pulled up in a worn-out Kubelwagen. He hadn't been here long, detached from some security unit, but he had already established an order based on fear and meaningless bureaucracy. He was the embodiment of that blind, bombastic faith in victory. Hauptmann Muller, he snapped, stepping out of the vehicle. His uniform, surprisingly, was nearly clean. I demand an allocation of 50 liters of high-octane petrol. Immediately. For what purpose, Hauptsturmfuhrer? It is highly classified. I must deliver valuable documents to headquarters in Bizerta. This is the Führer's order. You have no right to detain me. I have no high-octane petrol, I said calmly. All the petrol I have is earmarked for artillery fire or the evacuation of the wounded. Brandt turned red. You dare refuse me? I will report your sabotage. You are undermining the will to fight. Hauptsturmfuhrer. I stepped closer to him, lowering my voice. Your Kubelwagen can run on diesel mixed with impurities. But my last diesel is going to save the lives of 20 wounded men. If you cannot deliver your secret documents on foot, then perhaps they are not so important. Go to the hospital. They will give you water. His eyes burned with hatred, but he backed down. Ultimately, even the most fanatical SS officer understood that in this hole, his orders were worth less than a single can of petrol. He got into his vehicle and roared off, burning precious fuel. I watched him go. All their ideology, all their bravado, was shattered by one simple, humiliating fact. To fight, you must drive. And to drive, you need petrol. And we had none. By the end of the day, we had salvaged enough vehicles to move 100 men. I knew these men might be the last we could save. We were consuming our final chance, but at least we were doing it deliberately, saving human lives, rather than supporting a false strategy. Night fell, and with it, a ringing silence. No opposition in the sky, just the continuous, brazen roar of Allied bombers methodically dropping their payloads somewhere on the front line, knowing we couldn't retaliate. We were invisible, not because we were well hidden, but because we were too insignificant to waste shells on. The days of May 1943 in Tunisia arrived swiftly and mercilessly. The front crumbled like dried clay. The Americans and British tightened the pincers. Along the entire line, there was sporadic, chaotic fire, a sign of panic. Our headquarters finally relocated to a small, rocky bunker, originally intended as an ammunition depot. It was dark and damp, which was a relative blessing in the heat. On the 5th of May, a staff courier arrived on a battered Storch. I instantly knew what he carried. He looked like a ghost. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and his hands trembled. Hauptmann Muller, he managed a strained salute. General von Arnim's order. Immediate execution. I took the envelope. On the heavy, official paper was a single word, Scorpion. Operation Scorpion. Destruction of all unevacuable equipment, all supplies, ammunition, and documentation. Nothing shall fall into enemy hands. Degree of destruction, maximal. It was what I had expected. It was both liberation and the highest degree of humiliation. I, the man who had dedicated his life to preserving and distributing resources, was ordered to become a vandal. Meyer, I called for the Feldwebel. He was sitting in a corner, cleaning his old carbine as if it were the only thing that mattered. The order has come. Scorpioned. Meyer raised his head. He didn't look surprised. Just old. Finally, he said quietly. I thought we'd rot here guarding rusty tankers. I ordered the preparation of the demolition plan. We had to be methodical in our destruction, just as we had been methodical in our discipline. We collected the remnants of diesel, kerosene, even Italian olive oil. We were going to create a firestorm. I personally took charge of the inventory and destruction of the last items considered valuable, the Royal Depot. This was a small, deep bunker where captured artifacts, maps, generals' personal effects, and, laughably, crates of propaganda films were stored. It was the legacy of our African triumph. When I entered, I saw rows of crates. Old maps showing Tripoli when it was still ours. Captured weapons destined for a collection in Berlin. And among it all, several hundred cases of expensive French wine. The general's private stores. We burned this first, I told the soldiers. Everything, down to the last bottle. We began carrying out the wine. I smashed several bottles against a rock with a hammer. The smell of expensive alcohol, mixed with the scent of gunpowder and sand, was sickening. It was senseless wealth that proved utterly useless. But the hardest part lay ahead. The machinery. The destruction began at twilight. We wanted the fire to be visible, but the demolitions to occur under cover of darkness. The trucks went first. Meyer and his men attached explosive charges to the engines and fuel tanks. The very trucks I had tried so hard to save were now being turned into scrap metal. Meyer, are you sure this will work? I asked as we approached the last row of Opels. It will work, Captain. We didn't let them run for us, and we won't let them run for the enemy. The sound was deafening. Not the sound of artillery. This was a vicious, short, mechanical sound. Explosive flashes lit up the wadi. I felt neither anger nor sadness. Only emptiness. It was like burning one's own diaries or smashing a beloved tool so that it wouldn't fall into enemy hands. We reached the tank park. For Tigers and several Panzer IVs stood here. All had been written off due to transmission failure or lack of ammunition. They stood proudly, but immovably. Meyer approached Tiger number 322, the one that couldn't cover 100 kilometers. The Feldwebel gently patted the thick gun barrel. Sorry, old friend, he whispered. You deserved a better fate. We didn't blow them up. The explosives were too valuable. We doused them inside and out with the remnants of diesel and petrol mixed with olive oil. Meyer took a torch. He hesitated for a second. I nodded. He threw the torch. The fire ignited instantly. At first low, then, as the fuel and lubricant burned, the flames soared high. The spectacle was terrifying and mesmerizing. The camouflage burned off, then the paint, and the metal began to darken and deform. The heat was unbearable. It was like a funeral pyre for our African adventure. When the fire reached the tanks, there was a dull, prolonged thud. Smoke rose, black, oily columns climbing into the starless sky. This was the most humiliating moment of the entire campaign. We weren't surrendering them to the enemy. We were turning them into junk ourselves. We, the best engineers in Europe, were forced to destroy our own masterpieces because we couldn't provide them with the simplest necessity, fuel. Then came my turn. I had to destroy the last truck. It contained the unused spare parts from the convoy, the winter uniforms, the bearings for the non-existent Panthers. I ordered the soldiers to dump it all into a heap. I took another jerrycan, poured it over the useless clutter, and lit it. The fire was bright, but not as powerful as the tanks. It greedily consumed the wool uniforms that had never served their purpose. Plastic melted, paper burned. I stood and watched the fire. This was all that remained of my calculations, my efforts, my faith that order and discipline could overcome objective reality. In the morning, when we finished the final demolitions, fewer than 20 of us remained. We sat, exhausted, around a small puddle of water. Dust and soot covered us in a thick layer. On the horizon, a sound appeared. Not the roar of bombers, but the steady, methodical growl of diesel engines. The Allies. They approached not with an attack, but simply to close the circle. We were wreckage they had come to clear away. I saw the first Jeep. American. It was clean, fast, and clearly not conserving petrol. Behind it followed a line of trucks, Dodges, and Chevrolets. Dozens of them. Then the armor. I stood up, adjusted my uniform, though it was pointless, and raised my hands. A young, pink-cheeked American lieutenant, fully stocked with water and ammunition, stepped out of his Jeep. He looked neither angry nor triumphant, just tired. He glanced at the smoking remains of our Tigers. "Good job," he said, addressing our fire. The humiliation was complete. We had been defeated not by heroic effort, but by the prosaic, boring, overwhelming force of factories and ships. We sat under guard by the American soldiers. I felt no pain or fear, only emptiness. The physical exhaustion was so total that even my mind refused to work. I looked west. Over those hills lay the ocean. There lay America. One of the American soldiers, a tall and good-natured black man, offered me water from his canteen. I drank slowly. The water was cold, clean. It was water they could afford to waste. "You were an engineer?" The translator, an older German who had emigrated to the U.S., asked me. "I was a supply officer," I replied. "I tried to manage resources." The translator nodded understandingly. "Well, your country failed." I stared at the smoke. My humiliation was not in captivity. Captivity was merely the consequence. My humiliation was in the realization that my discipline, my devotion to duty, my willingness for self-sacrifice, were merely empty pomp against the backdrop of a prosaic, material fact. We Germans believed in the supremacy of will, in the supremacy of spirit. We believed that one genius could replace thousands of tons of steel. We believed that our ideology, our higher vision, would allow us to overcome any material obstacle. But the war was not a metaphysical battle. The war was a battle of arithmetic. I remembered the panther bearing I held in my hand. Perfect, flawless, but absolutely useless in the Tunisian sand. In a truck that lacked the simplest thing, fuel. The humiliation was that our tragedy was not a heroic fall. Our tragedy was that we were defeated not by better soldiers, but by better logistics. Supply, delivery, roads, ports, carrying capacity. These were the true heroes of the war. Not Rommel, not the Tigers, but ships full of oil and assembly lines working 3 shifts. I closed my eyes. The sand still grated on my teeth. This was the final taste of Africa. The taste of a defeat that was not a defeat of valor, but a defeat of reason. We were sent here with grand plans. We were supposed to seize Egypt. Instead, we burned our own equipment so it wouldn't fall into the hands of an enemy who possessed 100 times more. My profession as a logistician taught me that if the input stream equals 0, the output stream will eventually equal 0 too. And no amount of heroism can change that formula. And so I sit here, in the dust, captured by a nation that grasped that simple, boring truth. This was not a noble battle. This was demolition. We were a mathematical error that was erased.